Hi guys, today's video is going to be on the Lesson 25 rudiment, and really it's going to be on the name of the Lesson 25 rudiment, which oddly enough is not Lesson 25. That's just its position on the sheet. It's the 25th rudiment on the NARD sheet, which it was also the 25th rudiment in a certain book that we'll get into later. It's actually the 34th rudiment on the PAS 40, which is weird, but true. But none of those are its name. That's just its number. So what is its name? Well, it actually has a whole bunch of names, most of which are not very good, but it sure isn't Lesson 25. So let's get into that. So the rudiment we call the Lesson 25 was originally called the Quick Scotch, and that comes from the military signal, the Quick Scotch, which of course is a part of the Scotch in general, which has a quick portion and a slow portion, the slow Scotch and the quick Scotch. These were part of the Reveille sequence for the morning of the camp duty. You'd have three camps, the Dutch, the Hessian, the Austrian, the whatever, and the Scotches were part of that. And so basically, this is a very French idea where you call the rudiment after one of the most prominent signals that it's featured in. Their single drag tap, their double drag tap, their double stop rudiment, they're all called after the signal that they prominently appear in, rather than by sort of an onomatopoetic name, which is like how the patafla is. But it's like one of two ways that they generally name things over there. Well, this is one of the only times we've actually done it over here, but it's the same idea. So really the name the Quick Scotch didn't catch on super well, and there have been a ton of other ways to call this rudiment. So one of the first ones was by David Hazeltine in 1810. He calls this a stroke, a 3, and a 2, which the stroke is kind of extra, but we can sort of lump this into the Lesson 25 category, and you're going to see this concept of 3 and 2 come back in a whole bunch of the names that I talk about later. Basically because a drag is 3 notes. Let's say you started on the left hand, it's 2 lefts and a right. And then the Lesson 25 or the Quick Scotch goes on to have 2 more single strokes after that. So 3 for the drag, 2 for the other 2 notes. The next time it really pops up in a publication is in 1817, a book by Rumreel and Holton, and they call it the accent number 3, and it doesn't have any extra strokes or anything weird about it, but they call it the accent number 3. I don't remember off the top of my head what accent number 1 and accent number 2 are, but I don't think they're in any way related. This is sort of a one-off. No one ever called it the accent number 3 again that I'm aware of, but there you go. When you get to 1818, just a year later, Alvin Robinson calls it a 3 and a 2, which is really a lot like what Hazeltine called it, a stroke, a 3 and a 2, right? So this 3 and 2 concept comes back. It'll be used again by Colonel H.C. Hart in 1862, who elaborates on it. His names are often long and ridiculous. He calls it a quick 3 roll and 2 half beats. So a 3 roll being like a drag and 2 half beats being unaccented taps, essentially. So a quick 3 roll and 2 half beats. Again, you see that's the 3 and the 2 theme. So I think the reason these 3 and 2 names didn't really catch on throughout history in the long term is that they're very descriptive, but they're a mouthful. They don't roll off the tongue like, say, paradiddle does. So up to this point, pretty much all these names are numerical. 3 and a 2, quick 3 and a 2, a stroke, a 3 and a 2, a quick 3 roll and 2 beats, right? All these things are very sort of in the same vein. And then 1869, a book comes out by Gardner Strube called The Drum and Fife Instructor, and it lists its rudiments as quote-unquote lessons. Lesson 1, I think, is like the double stroke open roll. So they all have like a number and then a subtitle, the actual name of the rudiment. Until you get to the 25th lesson, which is the last lesson in the book, there is no name. It just says Lesson 25 and gives you the notation for what we know today as Lesson 25, which is kind of weird. It's the only one that doesn't have a name, a paradiddle, a flam, a ruff, whatever he wants to call that. It has a name until this one, just a blank, which leads us to wonder if he didn't know any of the previous names, or if he just forgot, or if it's a misprint. I'm not sure how there didn't get a name in there, but there wasn't one. And because there wasn't one, for some reason, drummers just latched on to the number. So essentially all those 3 and 2 names from before this point were completely discarded, and people just started calling it the Lesson 25 or the 25th rudiment, basically for many decades after this. The only time this doesn't happen really, there's a few specific instances later. Sanford Moeller of Moeller stroke fame, in 1925, he actually calls this a compound stroke, which is interesting because no one else had really ever called it that. I'm not sure where that came from. Then in 1942, William F. Ludwig of the Ludwig Drum Company, he calls it a rat-a-tap. And according to Paul Yoder in 1935, Ludwig was the person who invented the name rat-a-tap. He just came up with that himself. And he started using it, obviously, in the early to mid 30s. It really didn't come out in a book until the 40s that I'm aware of. But he just decided, oh, I don't like the name Lesson 25. He clearly didn't like any of the 3 and 2 variations. So he thought he would go with a more onomatopoetic, sound effect-based name, the rat-a-tap. The rat-a-tap really did not catch on either. There are only a few books I've ever seen that call it a rat-a-tap, and then it just kind of disappears from history. And that was really the last attempt to call this rudiment anything other than Lesson 25. Realistically, there are 8 different names for this rudiment, and when we think about what constitutes a good name for a rudiment, I think the perfect example is the paradiddle. Para means 2 single strokes, sort of in the French style of onomatopoetic rudiment naming. And diddle, we all know, means a double stroke. So if you play paradiddle, you've played 4 strokes, 2 singles and a double, and the rudiment and the syllables of its name line up so you can say it while you're playing it. It's perfect. Another name that I think is under the radar but is a really good name is the single stroke 4. Single stroke 4 has 4 syllables. There are 4 notes in the pattern, and it tells you that you're going to play 4 of them in single strokes in the name. So you can say the name and the name tells you what to do. It's a little bit more on the nose than paradiddle, but that's not a bad thing. If we look at the names we have for this rudiment, no name checks all the boxes. Basically, quick Scotch refers you to a piece of music that has the rudiment in it, but that's a stretch, and it doesn't have the right amount of syllables. Rat-a-tap sounds kind of like it, but you got to roll the R. It's not perfect, doesn't really have enough syllables. Compound stroke has neither the syllables, nor does it sound like it, nor does it tell you anything about it. So those names are pretty awful. All the 3 and 2 variations tell you exactly what to do, but you can't say any of them while you play it. They don't line up nicely. Which leaves us with accent number 3 and lesson 25, which irritatingly do have 5 syllables in both, but I think that's purely coincidental. They accidentally kind of line up when you say it, but unfortunately, neither of them tell you anything about how to play the rudiment or what it should sound like. So we're kind of left in this gray area. Obviously, I don't think anyone's going to stop calling it the lesson 25 just because it's pointed out that it's not the real name of the rudiment. Well, at this point in history, it is the real name of the rudiment, sort of unfortunately. So if we look at the possible names, obviously this isn't even the best one, but it's probably the reason it survived to the modern day is purely out of respect for Gardner Strube. Out of the 1860s, there were a whole bunch of books published because of the Civil War, and the only 2 that really made it out to civilian use were Strube and then Bruce and Emmett from 1862. When we look at the National Association of Rudimental Drummers, the 26 standard drum rudiments from 1933, we're looking at essentially the exact rudiments that were in Strube, plus they kind of promoted the single stroke roll to a real rudiment. That's where they get the 26th, because Strube only had 25. That's really the only difference. There was probably a lot of discussion, hemming and hawing, but that's how it ended up coming out. So of course they're going to use Strube's terminology, lesson 25, because they're basically just reprinting his rudiment list. Of course, Sanford Moeller was really a Bruce and Emmett guy. He says so in his book. He called it the compound stroke, but he wasn't a NARD founding member, so he wasn't in those discussions. And really, the compound stroke wouldn't have been a better name by any stretch of the imagination. Bruce and Emmett didn't really have the lesson 25 in their book, as far as I can tell. So, there really wasn't any way that we were going to call it anything else. It sort of had been set in stone since 1869, and like I said, the other attempts to change it, the compound stroke, the rat-a-tap, they didn't really catch on. So here we are, we're left with the lesson 25. I'm going to keep calling it that, you're going to keep calling it that, but now you kind of know what it could have been and why we sort of just still call it the lesson 25. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys next time.